You are listening to the War on the Rocks podcast on strategy, defense, and foreign affairs. I'm Doyle Hodges, executive editor of Texas National Security Review. For many people, terms like piracy, stowaway, and kidnap conjure up romantic visions, perhaps influenced by the literature of Robert Louis Stevenson, or if you're a Navy nerd like myself, maybe the literature of C.S. Forester. But as our guests today are going to tell us, these terms actually have deadly serious meanings without much romance and actually a great deal of grim reality to them. We're really privileged today to have Ian Urbina and Martina Vandenberg to talk about issues precisely of piracy, kidnapping, and stowaways on the high seas. I'll ask each of you to introduce yourselves real quickly.
My name is Ian Urbina. I'm a journalist and I work on lawlessness at sea.
And Martina.
My name is Martina Vandenberg, and I'm the president of the Human Trafficking Legal Center, and we try and stop lawlessness around the world.
So that's a relatively modest ambition. I'm sure that's something that you can knock out before lunch and then have the rest of the afternoon free. That's terrific.
Exactly right.
And Ian has been a little bit modest saying that he does this work. If you haven't had a chance, I highly commend his book, The Outlaw Ocean, which compiles and expands on a lot of the reporting he's done with the New York Times, looking precisely at issues of lawlessness at sea, but adding just a remarkable journalistic detail and flair. It's riveting, if at times dispiriting reading. One of the things that really inspired me to start looking at this topic right now was something that may have escaped the attention of many of our listeners if they don't routinely follow maritime issues. And that is just about 3 weeks ago, a product tanker, the Nave Andromeda, off of the Isle of Wight in the English Channel, was seized, although even that phrase is a little bit unclear because it appears that the stowaways on board were threatening the crew, but it's not clear that they physically took control of the vessel. But in any event, control of the vessel was compromised in some way by stowaways on board, resulting in the vessel declaring an emergency and British authorities conducting a rescue mission. In fact, a retired Royal Navy flag officer, Chris Perry, remarked that it was poor timing on the part of the stowaways to do this 50 miles by helicopter from the base of the Special Boat Service, which in fact was part of the response that took control of the vessel back. But what really struck me about this is we hear of piracy in a few locations around the world. We certainly hear of it in the Gulf of Aden. We hear of it in the Gulf of Guinea. To a lesser extent, there's concern about it in areas in Southeast Asia. But this wasn't piracy per se. This was a question of stowaways. And Ian, your work came to my mind immediately because you've done some of the most interesting and in-depth work on stowaways. I'm wondering if you can give our listeners a sense, what's the scale and scope of this? Who are stowaways generally, and what are they running from and to?
Yeah, I mean, I think you touch on a really important point, which is that in this realm, the sort of watery 2/3 of the planet, and especially the high seas portion of it, categories become especially murky. So in one and the same person, you may have a sea slave, a trafficked individual, a stowaway, a sea migrant, and ultimately a pirate, at different stages of that person's trip, if you will, across the space. They take on different roles. Now, scope, partially because that same person is multiple different characters, quantifying is always tough. And as you say, these characters vary in different places. So the waters off of Bangladesh, for example, have a really rich criminal history where kidnapping, extortion, piracy of a certain form, but it's usually sort of clustered in gangs, some of it quite organized, is rampant, but you rarely hear about it in the news. And the South China Sea and waters near Singapore as well have similar problems where there are organized clusters of extortionists and kidnappers. And what's the common denominator across a lot of these cases is the impunity. Well, a bunch of things. One, the murkiness and the efforts to police and counter and quantify, investigate, prosecute, especially tough in this realm. But also when bad things happen in whatever form we're talking about, they quite often happen with impunity. And I think my outlook is that much more often offshore do these crimes occur with impunity than they do onshore.
So that raises, I think, one of the central issues that runs through your work, and I know that, Martina, you deal with in your work as well, and that's the question of who has authority to take action in a case. So sticking with the nave Andromeda, we had a Liberian flagged vessel that's owned and operated by a Greek company with a multinational crew, with stowaways, presumably from somewhere on the African continent, and the incident taking place outside of territorial seas, but in the vicinity of Great Britain off the Isle of Wight. Who has the legal authority to respond to an incident like that?
Well, it depends. So if the ship has declared and requested help, then a lot of things get clarified, and the nearest authorities willing to help can help. They have jurisdiction upon request. If, however, the ship is not asking for help and the vessel is in the high seas and something bad is happening on it, then usually the question of authority first has to go through the flag registry. The laws that apply and the authority that's relevant and permissions that need to be granted usually on the high seas start with a flag registry. And then usually the insurers and the owners, the beneficial owners, are to be consulted at some point if there's a boarding. Now, if this is a vessel that has been deflagged, it's a stateless vessel, then a whole other set of rules apply. And generally speaking, they say that any nation willing to engage can engage a stateless vessel. But in this case, where there's a potential kidnapping or hostage situation on the high seas, if the crew are able to request help, then it becomes much simpler.
Sure. And you mentioned the state flag, and this is where the whole question of registries of convenience becomes particularly problematic, because Liberia, Panama, the Marshall Islands have outsized numbers of vessels registered there, but these are not states with the capacity to enforce law, even if they had an interest or willingness in doing so, correct?
That's right. Yeah. And these are not even states, right? These are businesses that have names of states associated with them, but Liberia is operated by a company in Virginia. So these are businesses also that have a fundamental conflict of interest because they're paid by the very ship owners, ship insurers that are often the ones needing to be enforced. And then lastly, these flag registries are typically peopled by the workforce consists of business people, businessmen. Once in a while, there's a lawyer on staff, but for the most part, these are bureaucrat and administrators. They're not folks who are well versed in the law or have any sense of fluency with investigation or sort of how they should engage in potentially criminal action.
Sure. And to the extent that they are legally fluent, it's more likely to be tax law than criminal law, because that's the whole purpose of the flag of convenience. So, Martina, some listeners may be wondering, so why do we have someone who's talking about trafficking in persons here where we're talking about these events at sea? And I recall the first time we met, the first time I heard you speak, the opening words of your remarks, I believe, were that you hated the movie Taken. And, I think that sets terrific context for it. If you could help explain to our readers, how does this legal landscape affect your work?
So I do hate the movie Taken because it gives a completely inaccurate visual of what human trafficking looks like. And actually, if you want to see what human trafficking and forced labor look like in the 21st century, I recommend you read Ian Urbina's book, because The Outlaw Ocean has chapter after chapter, case after case, deep investigatively reported incidents involving people held on ships, on fishing vessels in forced labor, who suffer some of the most egregious human rights violations that we see in this century. And if you think about it, a lot of Ian's work has focused on the fishing industry and fishers who are held on these vessels. And I hope Ian will talk about that as well, because it's such an important feature of the book. But from my perspective as a lawyer, the question is always, how do you end this impunity? How do you actually bring these essentially modern day slave masters to justice? And you've raised the fundamental question, and that's the question of jurisdiction. Now, the one positive thing that Congress has done, and Congress has done so much wrong that, it's kind of a miracle when we can point to something that's positive. Congress gave us the authority to bring cases in US courts where the perpetrator is an American citizen, a green card holder, or someone present in the United States, no matter where the abuse occurred. So in theory, we have extraterritorial jurisdiction in some of these cases to bring perpetrators to justice in US courts. But the problem is it doesn't happen. The Department of Justice has brought exactly 0 criminal cases to hold accountable any forced labor perpetrator in any supply chain, including the seafood supply chain.
Some people who are less engaged with questions of law of the sea and maritime jurisdiction claims, the term international waters connotes sort of a free-for-all zone. And I'm reminded of the episode of The Simpsons where they go out to international waters and Mr. Burns explains that without that, they would never know the joy of a monkey knife fight. But despite this, what you're describing is an area in which laws are it that can be enforced on states in this area outside of their strict territorial jurisdiction?
So that's actually a question for Ian, because Ian, in his masterful book, actually looks very, very deeply at these questions of whose law applies. And unfortunately, I think, Ian, your conclusion is by and large, this is a lawless zone.
You're too generous, Martina, in your description of the book. And me, I do think you're right that the reality of the space is as if it's a buffer zone where if lawyers or human rights advocates or journalists or lawmakers or whomever wanted to attempt to bolster some sort of correction of these human rights and labor abuses, and the abuses occurred in this space, my sense is the only hope to succeed in that effort would be to go after these players after they leave that buffer zone. And this is where Martina and her firm are especially adept because people don't stay out on the high seas or even in territorial waters indefinitely. At some point, they do come to shore, and even if they don't for long periods, their supply chains do connect to shore, right? And those are the handles from an enforcement point of view that adept practitioners like Martina make use of. But unlike sweatshop garments or blood diamonds, these supply chains, the fish supply chains, are really vexing, because the part of the supply chain that runs from the port to the hook or the net is incredibly hard to connect those dots. And if you have this requirement and now I'm drifting outside my lane here, but the laws that exist, generally speaking, often have such a high bar on proof of intentionality and proof of awareness of the nefarious behavior, that if you have that high bar on land, it's tough to do these cases. If you have that high bar with a supply chain that goes dark from port to hook, and you need to connect the players, much less their awareness and their intentionality, then it becomes extremely hard to prosecute these. But nonetheless, there are successes, and that's where Martina comes in.
So I'm curious, we've been discussing right now mostly within the fishing sector, and we've sort of implicitly focused on Southeast Asia. But I'm curious about the scope of this, both in terms of geographically, whether this is something that is occurring in other areas of the world as well, but also economically. Are there other sectors that are using this practice of trafficked and enslaved persons in order to support their labor requirements in the maritime zone?
I think absolutely that's the case. And one of the things that we say is that in global supply chains, forced labor is a feature and not a bug, right? The entire system at this point is predicated on the existence of labor exploitation and forced labor. Ian has traveled around the globe doing this investigative reporting and has found cases around the globe. And in one case that I wondered if you could talk about is the case of the cell phone that you found that showed a killing, which actually has led to some semblance of accountability in that case.
Yeah, I'm happy to talk about that one. I will say just briefly with regard, Doyle, to your first question about the sort of problematic focus, and I count myself among the guilty in the realm of journalism, of fixating on the South China Sea and the Thai fleet. There is a distinctly acute problem in the South China Sea. So the waters near Myanmar and Laos, Cambodia, Vietnam, Thailand, and there are specific reasons for the problem being especially bad there. But one of the most interesting cases occurred off the coast of New Zealand, and it was a South Korean fleet, and this was very well documented. The government investigated extensively, and in some ways, I love this case because it shows, off the coast of Ghana, off the coast of the Falkland Islands, off the coast of New Zealand, you find lots of these similar cases, and that I think is largely because certain core institutions exist in maritime. One of them is the existence of manning agencies. And these are these sort of, in my view, there's some good manning agencies. They handle the logistics and they find you the crew to get on your boat quickly. They handle contracts and tickets and visas and stuff like that, the logistics of moving workers around. And they're essential to maritime and seafood supply chain. A lot of them are really shady, and they're essentially incorporated human trafficking operations that have, contracts that are rife with debt bondage and other problems, and then also sort of inherent tacit mechanisms within them that look the other way at exactly the tactical moment when the really bad things happen to those workers. And these manning agencies have no interest or ability to actually correct them. And the companies that are making use of the workers and doing bad things to them just point back to the manning agencies as this is their responsibility. So to your question, this is a global problem. Now to the murder video. The murder video, is this video that was on the cell phone that was found in the back of a taxi in Fiji. It was handed over to police. Police got it to Interpol. And source at Interpol got it to me. It was on the footage is 10 minutes and 26 seconds, sort of slow motion slaughter. And what you see is these men in the water, they're whatever they were before the shooting, before the filming. When you see them on camera, they're no longer a threat. Whether they were pirates previously or not, they're in the water now and they're fleeing. They're unarmed and they're 2 stories below whoever is shooting at them. And the vessels that are surrounding them are Taiwanese tuna longliners. This footage was brought to us 2015, 2014, did a year-long investigation, trying to highlight, okay, here's a case where you've got footage of men, at least 5 being killed. They're unarmed. At the end of the video, they posed for some of the at least witnesses, of, if not also culprits, posed for selfies. So you've got faces of the guys. We were able to identify 2 of the ships at the scene, all the way up to their owners and the companies in Taiwan that run them. So this feels like a slam dunk, right? You've got murder on camera, and yet, we put it on the front page of the Times, got very little attention and action from relevant governments. And only 2 months ago, ultimately in the book, we were able to identify, much thanks to the work of a really intrepid investigator named Kars von Hoeslen, we were able to identify the captain of the ship where the murder was ordered. And the Taiwanese eventually, 2 months ago, arrested that captain. But the point of this, that's a complete rarity, and it took 6 years of drum beating to finally get that one prosecution. And the case isn't even done. So I think it speaks more to the problem than to a happy solution.
And that actually is really useful and frightening context to what Martina brought up, which is some of the work that you've done, especially in the Thai fishing fleet. And I think those are some of the most gripping and disturbing chapters in your book are the ones in which you have embarked with the permission of the captain and with the knowledge of the Thai government on fishing vessels and are observing this firsthand. Could you tell us a little bit about what you saw there and perhaps also how you created the connections and the trust to be able to do that?
Yeah, so the Thai reporting in particular occurred in 2 key stints. One was in 2015 for a long stint and it was destined for the New York Times. And then I went back a year and a half, 2 years later while reporting the book, essentially to revisit some of the key players and the issue more generally, to see how the Thai government was doing at that point. The original reporting set out to look at a sort of sub genre of ships, if you will. The worst concerns about sea slavery, as it's often called, were on distant water fishing vessels. So these vessels that go far away, stay at sea for a long time. And quite often, the transshipment subset of them, the vessels that stay out at sea, sometimes for a year, 2 years on end, keep fishing, and they offload their catch to motherships that bring it to shore. And that subsection of ships was, again, as told to me by the likes of Martina and her firm and others, Human Rights Watch and Greenpeace and Environmental Justice Foundation, who'd done a lot of amazing research on this kind of problem before. Like if I could find a way to get on those ships, those would be the ones where I would hear the stories, where I'd see the really acute situation. So it took about 5 weeks initially to succeed in getting out on those vessels. Those vessels tend to be 100, 150, 200 miles from shore, at least. The really worst case, the Thai ones are out near Somalia, really far away. We couldn't find captains willing to take us out the full distance and get us onto those vessels. We could find captains that were willing to take us out 50, 60 miles and then talk our way, our being a photographer, a translator, and I, talk our way onto a next vessel and, a hopscotch out to the vessels. And we were successful at getting on several vessels that had this situation, right? The situation being typically 5 Thai officers, sometimes 30 to 40 crew. Almost always the crew were between the ages of, I think there was a 13-year-old on board, but most of them are 15, 16 up to 30, 35. They're almost always, at least in the Thai fleet, they're always non-Thai. Thais don't take those jobs. So they're usually Burmese, Rohingya, Cambodian, as was the case in the vessel we really spent time on. And in this case, it was 5 Thai officers, 40 Cambodian crew. And all of those crew had been, if your definition is force, fraud, and coercion, kind of one of those ingredients being key to an understanding of a trafficked individual, I had a broader sense in my head of debt bondage and other sort of key elements which fit within that. But if that's the spectrum of trafficking you're looking at, all of them were trafficked. Most of them had come into Thailand with what they call a labor broker, but a trafficker, and incurred debt in the process that then was handed off to the captain. And so they were to some degree owned by the captain until that debt was paid down. And some of them, too, in particular, had been the opposite end of the spectrum, outright kidnapped. They had been at a brothel or a karaoke bar 1 minute, next minute they woke up on a ship, and they're not even sure what went down in between, but they're pretty sure they got drugged, and that's as much as they could speculate. So that was the vessel that we really focused on in particular and spent some time on talking with those guys and their living conditions and work and life.
Ian's investigation on this is remarkable and so worth reading. If you want to read that same horror from the perspective of the victim who lived it, there's a Cambodian man named Vanek Prum who signed up to work in essentially like a fish drying factory on land. He needed money for his wife who was pregnant. He is one of these that Ian discusses who was kidnapped, like the ones in Ian's book. And he ended up on a vessel. Vanek Prum is an amazingly gifted artist. And so when he finally escaped years later, his family didn't believe him. His family thought that he had simply abandoned them and had just not come home and had, lived high on the hog for years. The reality was he had been held in forced labor on a fishing vessel. And then in order to explain to his family what happened, he drew pictures. Those pictures were published in a book called The Dead Eye and the Deep Blue Sea. And so really a companion volume to Ian Urbina's brilliant work, The Outlaw Ocean, is Vanek Prum's book, which shows in literally, no pun intended, graphic detail what this looks like over a period of years of being held in forced labor on one of these fishing vessels.
And Doyle, let me throw in one more. I think this is really smart. of Martina to round out the meal. And Vanek's book is amazing, especially because it's firsthand. A third part of the meal I would add is Ghost Fleet, which offers yet a third perspective on the same problem. And it's largely the perspective of this sort of underground railroad of rescuers who go out and attempt to find the Vaneks, and help them get home. Because often Vanek and these guys in general, if they make it off the vessel alive, they have no idea where they are. And by the time they do, they've settled down and they've maybe even got a partner and kids, and they've sort of accepted, oh, I guess I'm in Indonesia, or I guess I'm on some island in Malaysia. And now they're stuck there and they don't have any real capacity to find their way back home. The language barriers, the finances, et cetera, the emotional walls. And so Ghost Fleet is a story about a woman who and her organization that goes and looks for these guys and tries to help bring them home. And so the three of those things together, I think, will give you a really well-rounded meal on this issue.
So we're describing a really challenging and somewhat bleak landscape, both from a human perspective, but also from a legal perspective in terms of what recourse there is and what options are available. After the terrorist attacks of 9/11, some areas of seemingly intractable criminal behavior suddenly became much more tractable because the government had a security interest in trying to track things like money transfers of people. It strikes me that there are potentially security concerns associated with the whole process of trafficking persons that go beyond the human security dimensions, which themselves are critically important, but go to more traditional hard power security concerns. If these networks can be used to transfer other cargoes, if they can be used in order to facilitate the hiding or disappearing of someone who has a desire to stay away from the prying eyes of authorities. I'm curious, Martina, have you seen any improvement in the legal tools available or any effort to couch this in hard power security terms in order to access more of these tools?
Doyle, it's interesting because the wake-up call on that came not on the high seas, but it actually came with ISIS. Because ISIS created a market for human beings, right? ISIS was actually kidnapping and selling women and children into sexual slavery. And so that sort of market that was really in the heart and soul of terrorist networks in the world, I think gained the attention and made this a hard power issue. The other piece of this, though, that I want to flag that's so dangerous is states dealing with smuggling and calling it trafficking so that they can block people who are legitimately fleeing and seeking asylum. And so the European Union is really the worst offender on this, where there are boats coming from Libya, coming across, trying to land, and the governments are calling this trafficking when we all know that this is actually smuggling. Ironically, what's happening on land in Libya is trafficking for forced labor. Like there's actually there were reports by CNN of a slave market in Libya. The trafficking is happening in Libya, actually getting on one of the ships to try, or dinghies, frankly, to try and get to Europe. That's not a trafficking situation. So I worry much, much more about the misuse of trafficking rhetoric and the misuse of trafficking conceptions in order to halt migration of desperate people.
I wonder if I can jump in there. I mean, it's really timely. I just got back from an embed on the Mediterranean with some organizations, Doctors Without Borders and Red Cross in particular. And what Martina says is exactly right. The militarization of search and rescue has been the current Italian government's new approach to stopping the inflow of migrants. The last government had a more bare-knuckled, sort of explicit, we need to stop them, and we're going to put boats out there and push them back into Libyan waters, etc. The new administration, and they got toppled electorally for that reason. The new administration came in with a bit more of a softer rhetoric But what they've done is they've done the exact same thing and in some ways way more effectively by moving these mechanisms into administration. They've weaponized health administration in the form of selectively applying, say, COVID rules on not cruise ships, not cargo ships, but Doctors Without Borders ships, and ridiculous rules that apply to those ships that keep those ships locked in. And they've also very tactically, as Martina points out, changed the definition of sea migrants, refugees into trafficked individuals, and the traffickers. And there's been a arrest of a Doctors Without Borders ship captain on this, are the search and rescue organizations, which are clearly not engaging in trafficking. And if you just want to be a good journalist and channel the Italian perspective, the portion of Italy that agrees with this notion, what they would say is, no, Doctors Without Borders is indeed involved in trafficking because by being out there and rescuing these migrants on the high seas, if they make it out of Libyan waters, they're incentivizing and encouraging more of them to leave. And you can see on a commonsensical level how there might be merit to that argument, but there's no evidence actually support it. There's a lot of evidence to state the contrary, that they don't encourage this flow of individuals by any means. What encourages them are the push factors that exist on the African continent and Libya in particular. So anyway, I just echo Martina's point.
Yeah, if I can jump on what Ian said, I mean, what we have is the weaponization of human trafficking, right? And so I'm so glad that you did that embed because it's so instructive of how these legal concepts can be twisted and weaponized to actually have exactly the opposite impact than intended.
Yeah, and it creates some remarkably perverse incentives for mariners at sea as well, because of course you have an obligation to assist someone who is in distress. And by definition, given the loading of these vessels and the conditions in which they're operating, they're in distress from the moment they're underway. But at the same time, you also have this issue that as soon as you start rendering the types of aid that these people really need, then a responsibility attaches for their welfare that the state often doesn't want to take on. And so you have perverse incentives where vessels that are unseaworthy are taken under tow, despite the fact that the unseaworthiness remains a challenge, other sorts of things going on. And it's really a horrifying and intractable situation that, is just difficult for the mariners charged with enforcing it, for mariners who may encounter it in through traffic, and unimaginable for those who are in such desperate circumstances that this is what they're doing to flee.
You made this reference to 9/11, and I know your listenership has a heavy proportion of military-minded folk, and there is an interesting arc here when it comes to the notion of the high seas, especially as a relatively lawless place, and why we should care. And really the authority on this was The Outlaw Sea by Langewiesche, which was my sort of inspiration in calling it The Outlaw Ocean, my book, a beautifully written, incredibly well reported piece of journalism. But at its core, it's deeply limited by the fact that, in my view, it was written shortly after 9/11 with a real fixation on a central concern that has not panned out, which is the notion of terrorists using the extra legal and policeless nature of the seas to hit the U.S. or other Western nations, be it by putting a dirty bomb in a shipping container or some other method. And a huge portion of that book is focused on that worry. And that worry has not panned out. I mean, there have been isolated incidents, especially, in India, the attack came by sea there. But generally speaking, despite huge gaping holes in port security, for whatever reason, those who want to engage in military action against the U.S. Have not tended to opt for the maritime route. On the other hand, I think I saw a statistic, it might be old now, but something on the order of 60-70% of all drugs that get in the U.S. come by sea, not by border. And so the drug threat as it travels by sea is a real one. All this is a long sort of winded setup to say, from a strictly security point of view, until we start seeing, say, the food security of developing nations or human rights of other non-Americans as security issues, I think we're going to struggle to make a direct military to connection to these issues. I very much think that human rights are a security concern. Food security for other nations is a security concern, but it's a sort of a 4-variable equation as opposed to, say, a 1-variable equation with a dirty bomb arriving in the port of New York.
And that's actually a really interesting segue, because a tiny Pacific Island nation that few people may be familiar with was in the news recently when the president of Palau invited the United States to develop facilities for joint access and training there. And having been to Palau when I was in command of a Navy salvage ship, my thought was this isn't so much developing as creating, and that the impact on the environment there would be irreversible and inestimable. The chapter in your book discussing Palau's challenges with combating IUU fishing is really compelling to me. And it does frame these as a security concern, because indeed this is central to Palau's economic viability. Could you talk just for a few minutes about that?
Yeah, I mean, so Palau is this funky nation, archipelago nation with the land mass of, say, land space of Philadelphia and the sea space of France. And when I went there, I was intrigued for the David and Goliath story of, here was this country that 50% of its GDP was on water tourism, and quite especially shark watching. It also was in this area where it had a massive onslaught of South Korean, Taiwanese, Chinese, even Vietnamese boats routinely entering its waters and hoovering up everything from sharks to coral reefs to large oysters to everything, right? And so, and here you had this country that had one patrol boat, and so I thought, okay, well, that's the story, just that sort of effort. The existential crisis that Palau faces in its poaching problem, not to mention climate change disappearing the outer flag posts, if you will, that maintain the territorial parameters of that nation. As some of those outposts go underwater, all of a sudden their claim to that space disappears from a geopolitical point of view, and they start shrinking as a country. And that's a real worry. But also just the presence of these fleets that are routinely poaching their marine life is a real threat. Now, is that a security threat for the U.S.? Well, if you believe that having our friends, our allies' backs is ethically right and also pragmatically prudent, if we want to, quite especially with the Chinese, begin to check their growth in the maritime space, growth that is often occurring through proxy presence of semi-civilian fishing boats, but really are about establishing facts on the ground, if you will, by a presence there, and then precedent of our fishing boats have been there for 10 years. Of course, we have rights, and that precedent then allows you to argue certain things when it comes to oil and gas mineral rights and throughway rights and all these sorts of things. And that's what's going on with the Chinese. If you're going to counter that and think long term, then you need Palau. If I'm the head of the Navy, and I'm thinking, we need the Palaus out there, and we need to help them fight the fight, because if they lose that fight, then we lose our stake in the world. So I think from a security perspective, the existential crisis that Palau faces has a lot of self-interest for the U.S.
Yeah, and under the Compact of Free Association, the United States has responsibility for the military defense of Palau. So to the extent that it is a problem addressable through naval resources, those naval resources, as distinct from law enforcement or patrol resources, would be United States Navy resources. That's So it strikes me with so much of this surrounding the question of fishing. If I go to certain high-end grocery chains right now, I'm going to find a certification that the fish I buy has been humanely caught, that the fish didn't suffer in the process of that, and that there was no excess bycatch or other environmental depredations. Martina, is there any effort to certify that the people who were involved in this process have been humanely treated, or any legal recourse to try to label the value of the humans involved in this chain at least as equal to that of the animals?
So Doyle, I'm so glad that you asked that because, there's certainly parallel certification regimes that try and say that this chocolate, for example, is slave free, or this particular tea is free of forced labor. But there is immense skepticism in the human rights movement, immense skepticism in the anti-trafficking movement to what we call the audit industrial complex, right? It's essentially a for-profit set of organizations that do these certifications, and we're very skeptical about their veracity. The other piece of this, though, is we do have different tools. I think generally when we think of accountability, we think of civil courts, we think of criminal courts, we think of putting perpetrators in prison. We're looking more and more now at trade remedies. And so the Tariff Act of 1930 has a section which allows all goods made wholly or in part by forced labor, and that would include seafood caught on the kinds of ships that Ian embedded in, bans all of those goods from entering the US market. Now, the trick is creating a sufficiently traceable global supply chain so that you can identify the fish from a particular vessel to the end importer here in the United States so that you can have customs and border protection seize that at port. And there's some brilliant researchers who are doing this work. So Ian mentioned Greenpeace. Andy Shen and his colleagues at Greenpeace are doing remarkable work tracing that supply chain, particularly with longline tuna, identifying vessels that have documented cases of forced labor, and convincing the US government to prevent those goods from entering the US market. That seems to be really the only measure that hits corporations in the pocketbook in a way that they understand, because no one wants to have their shipment of tuna on ice in a container suspended at port. There's an expense associated with that. So hitting them in the pocketbook seems to be, through these trade remedies, seems to be sort of one of the main strategies that we can now use, because as Ian has pointed to, there's tremendous frustration with the impunity that continues.
And I would throw one thing in there, which is if you think of what Martina's exactly right in pointing out, that there are real successes to point to, and Andy Shen is a hero in this regard when it comes to surgical actions to target individual supply chains. And that's a sort of a market play, if you will. The other thing that I've seen that I think works to some degree is if you look at the yellow card, red card system in Europe, when I was on both trips in Thailand, well, if you think that there are two big mechanisms. So US State Department Trafficking in Persons report is a sort of siloed bureaucratic tool that every year gets used to rank countries on their performance on these things, industry by industry, et cetera. And it has some teeth, and some players, from what I can tell, take it somewhat serious. You don't want to get a tier 3, bad ranking in the tip report. It just doesn't play out well, and there are some consequences for that industry in your country. Way bigger and scarier, from what I've seen, is getting red carded by the EU. And when Thailand was on the verge of getting red carded for trafficking concerns in its seafood supply chain, man, did I see that government sit up and take notice, because the financial repercussions are huge. And both of those tools are government led, and they are human rights focused, and they are important. So in addition to the individual surgical tools that Martina pointed to, I also think the EU red carding system is one worth studying, and it can have an effect.
So Ian, you're so right. And part of the problem has been this whack-a-mole approach, right, of going after individual perpetrators, when what we really need is systems change. We need change that can alter the entire fundamental infrastructure of how fishing works around the globe. And one additional point that I'll make, where there is actually an intersection with the Department of Defense, Doyle, is for years, we have been pointing out that the US government is the largest consumer around. And so several years ago, the Department of Defense held a meeting in Hawaii about the Department of Defense's own supply chain for providing fish to troops. And there are federal acquisition regulations that prohibit government contractors from using forced labor in the performance of a contract. And now, more and more, governments like the United States, but also Canada, I recently had meetings with Canadian officials. They're looking at their own procurement supply chains as governments in order to eradicate forced labor in those supply chains, including forced labor to produce seafood.
It's interesting. The more you guys speak of this, the more it strikes me that the parallels with terrorism are strong, not necessarily, as you pointed out, Ian, in the sense that it is a vector for terrorist activity, but the fact that it is inherently transnational, the fact that the financial is often one of the most successful, if not one of the most glamorous ways of getting at the problem, and the fact that it so impacts the human security questions and breeds in areas of poverty, despair, displacement, war, all the things that we've come to associate with causes of terrorism as well. I really wish that we had more time to continue this conversation. Unfortunately, we've come up on the end of our time. We've been speaking with Ian Urbina, a journalist and author of The Outlaw Oceans, and Martina Vandenberg, who heads up the Human Trafficking Legal Center. You can follow Ian on Twitter at Ian_Urbina or at Outlaw Ocean, and Martina at HT Legal Center. I really appreciate you guys taking the time to do this, and I really appreciate and admire the work that you're doing to spotlight and combat stuff that, by its very definition, occurs out of our sight and thus often out of our consciousness. Thanks very much.
Thank you for listening to the War on the Rocks podcast, and do not forget to check out our written content at warontherocks.com and our membership program at warontherocks.com/subscribe. And please, please, take a moment to rate us on iTunes. 5 stars, of course. It really does make a difference.